So much for that very kind introduction, Seraphin. I want to start by thanking Seraphin and everybody at the Munich School of Philosophy. So I'm going to share my screen here. So today, my talk, Seraphin actually very helpfully provided some context for the work that I've been doing. I've been in the last, I guess, 10 or so more years, I've been working on Hegel and German idealism, and I've been particularly interested in how the concept of life plays an absolutely central role, and increasingly, to my mind, not just for Hegel, but for understanding the context of post-Kantian philosophy. And in moving my thinking and my research from Hegel forward to the 19th century, thinking about more and more about the connections between Hegel and Marx, Seraphin mentioned this very important concept in Feuerbach in the early Marx of Gattungswesen. And I think this idea that my talk today, in some ways, is trying to build a bridge between how Hegel thinks about the idea of species life and the connection to ethical life, and whether or not that can help us build a bridge to certain ideas that come to the fore in Marx. Today, I'm pretty much only going to talk about Hegel, and the main sort of focus of my talk is to try to think about whether or not questions of species life, eventually what will come to be known as species being, what does it matter that we are a living being among living beings, that living beings are members of species? How do those questions and ideas matter for thinking about ethical life? So that will be the focus of my talk today. One of the things that I think is incredibly unique about Hegel, and again, I'm focusing on Hegel, but increasingly I'm viewing this way of thinking, this broadly naturalistic way of thinking, as common among many post-Kantian philosophers, from Fichte to Schelling to Hegel, and of course to Marx. But one of the unique things about Hegel in this tradition is that they really want to take seriously the idea that our historical forms of ethical life can really only be understood and assessed, that they can only be understood and evaluated in connection with our existence as fundamentally living beings and as social beings. I think in the general sort of discussions and scholarship in Hegel and post-Kantian philosophy, a lot of attention has been paid to this idea that we are social beings, and I think that is, of course, undeniably true. But this idea that we are also living beings is something that has received somewhat less attention. And I actually think that this idea of being living and social really come together. And we can see the idea of species life being a key concept that tells us why being a social being and a living being sort of necessarily go together. In Hegel, I think we get this very original approach to the idea, an idea, again, generally associated, perhaps more associated with Marx, but I actually think Hegel provides us with a lot of conceptual tools for thinking about this very deeply, that our historical shapes of ethical life are really an outgrowth of certain broader processes of life. And one of the technical terms I'm going to introduce in this talk, and I promise it's really going to be the only, even though it's a talk about Hegel, I promise it's the only technical term that I will be using today. But I think it's important for understanding the importance of species and species life. Hegel essentially refers to the processes of species life as Gattungsprozesse. And obviously since this is the Munich School of Philosophy, the reason I like bringing up this technical term is, of course, we see very clearly the connection between this idea of a Gattungsprozess and potentially the connection to the later use of the term Gattungswesen. Again, I'm not going to talk at all about this idea of Gattungswesen directly today. I'm only going to focus on how Hegel understands this, what I think is a very unique approach to the idea of species life, where he refers to this in terms of the Gattungsprozess, or a process of the species. So very, very roughly, what is the significance of this technical concept? I think it actually provides us the basis for, or the outlines of, a broadly historical materialist approach to thinking about ethical life. Now, historical materialism is obviously a very complicated theory in and of itself. All I mean by that today, for the purposes of this talk, is that processes of the species give shape, and processes of life more broadly, give shape and determinacy to forms of consciousness. And this is something in sort of a very important classic statement that we get from Marx's German ideology, that where he says that consciousness does not determine life, but life determines consciousness, where the idea of Bestimmtheit is not about determining in a kind of in the English, right? Determine sounds like it's connected with determinism, but what this means is that life gives shape to, gives determinateness, gives a determinate form to our shapes of consciousness. And so this is all I want, this is the broad thought that I'm associating here with a historical materialist approach to ethical life. And in this talk, I'm going to think about the process of the species, or a Gattungsprozess, as a concretely universal form of life process and life activity that enables and constrains both individual and social historical processes of reproduction, and provides us with some normative standards for understanding those processes of reproduction and whether or not they are succeeding or failing, whether they are enabling the flourishing of individuals or whether they are pathological in some sense. Later in the talk, I'm actually specifically going to draw out 3 aspects of how Hegel understands the species process that helps us that provides some of these normative standards, and they pertain, and I'm just going to list them right now, but hopefully later in the talk they'll become a little bit more clear, that processes of the species address needs, they address fundamental needs, they address the needs of dependency and longing, which in the sphere of ethical life become demands for recognition from the other, or sort of a very familiar idea in Hegel, this idea of recognition. And they also address, interestingly, this dimension that perhaps doesn't get discussed quite as much, issues of disease and death, that processes of the species need to somehow attend to or consider processes of disease and death. And I think this is a third interesting dimension that I'll try to talk about later in the talk. And very broadly, I also think that thinking about this idea of a process of the species or species life in Hegel allows us to understand questions broadly about individual and social reproduction. So, let's see here. There we go. So, so my talk today is going to proceed in 3 parts. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to, this is the only one technical term, but we don't have to be daunted by the tech. It's really just what does it mean to talk about a process of the species? What does it mean to talk about a species process? The first part of my talk is going to address this question, and here I will be turning to what I think are some really important moments across Hegel's work, where it becomes very clear that this idea is incredibly important for Hegel's philosophical thinking. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about ethical life as what I'm going to call a self-conscious Gattungsprozess. And I'm going to focus in particular on 2 institutions. So I'm not going to talk about all 3 institutions of ethical life. Hegel thinks that our shape of ethical life together consists in modernity of 3 primary institutions, namely the family, civil society, and the state. I'm going to focus primarily here on the family and civil society, and I'll give some reasons for why I'm doing that later on in the talk. And then in the third section, I'm going to talk very briefly. I'm really just going to sort of gesture towards how I think Hegel's way of thinking about the connection between species life and ethical life could be important for contemporary ways of thinking about social reproduction, including what is now known in some Marxian circles as social reproduction theory. But this last part is really just going to be maybe more of a provocation and things that I would like to continue thinking about. So the first part of the talk, what is the Gattungsprozess? So one difficulty, I've been referring already to this idea of a Gattungsprozess as basically a species life and processes of the species. There are some difficult translation issues, which is another reason why throughout the talk, I won't always be translating this term into an English equivalent is, of course, that Gattung and Art are relative terms. In the English translations of Hegel, Gattung has been generally translated as genus, and when Hegel uses the term Art, that gets translated as species. But rather than I'm not going to get embroiled with these questions of translation here. One reason why I continue to use the term species is because I think it's important for seeing the connection between how Hegel uses the term Gattung and Gattung's process as connected with the later development of this idea of Gattungswesen and species being. So that's one reason I at least in the English, I use the idea of species rather than genus. I'll say a little bit more in a minute why I still think that species is a little bit more appropriate here. But the important thing to say about the terms Gattung and Art are that they are of course relative terms. More importantly, Hegel is given he's interested in the sort of philosophical way. What is the philosophical significance of thinking about the idea of a Gattung or a Gattungsprozess? Process? And he's not at all interested in a project of taxonomy or classification, biological classification. And so the way that we use these terms now in our contemporary discourse does not directly map on to how Hegel was understanding these ideas. So just to sort of abstracting from these contemporary, taxonomic questions are not only contemporary, but our way of thinking, our way of talking about classification now, bracketing from those questions, I want to simply say that the idea of a Gattung, understood in its broadest sense, is interested in the question of kinds. Now, Hegel, I think, uniquely in a modern context, he is very much also inspired and reappropriating some ideas from Aristotle here in his way of thinking about this. Hegel is primarily interested in trying to understand the philosophical significance of thinking about the idea of a species or kind. And there very quickly, we could talk about each of these in great detail, because I think they're all incredibly rich and complicated. But very quickly, I just wanted to flag that for Hegel, the very idea of a Gattung or a kind has at least three ways of providing, they're philosophically significant in at least three ways. The first is that for Hegel, the idea of a kind, the idea of a Gattung, provides us with a very important and basic way of understanding universality as something concrete as opposed to abstract. That the idea of the idea of a species provides us with a very basic way of understanding what he calls universality, unity, and simplicity, and that he's interested in using this term and thinking about this term and how it might be useful for us, because he thinks that it gives us a different way of understanding universality. And the primary distinction here is that he thinks that it gives us a basis for thinking about universality in concrete terms as opposed to in abstract terms. The second philosophical significance of this idea of a Gattung or a kind is that Hegel argues that kind concepts provide us with an evaluative context, that to understand and evaluate individual things is really only possible if we understand them as individuals of particular kinds. And now this is going to hold not just for living beings, but Hegel sort of has these really interesting ways of thinking about this, the importance of the evaluative context of kind membership in many different ways. So two examples I'll just quickly give here are, we can think about artifacts and art, right? So to evaluate whether or not a particular, familiar example, an individual knife cuts well, we have to understand what knives are as a kind of thing. A more interesting example, I think, is in the case of art, where Hegel clearly thinks that kind concepts, or here we might use genre concepts, that evaluating individual artworks, we can't really evaluate them as such. We have to evaluate them as depending on their particular genre, right? And that if it's a sculpture, or if it's a piece of poetry, or if it's a piece of music. And so kind concepts provide very broadly for Hegel an evaluative context for understanding and evaluating individual things. The third philosophical significance, and this is perhaps the most complicated, is that Hegel thinks that the idea of a Gattung is very important for understanding self-consciousness. There's something counterintuitive about this in Kant and in broadly, I'll just stick with Kant and Fichte for now. Self-consciousness, of course, is understood as the I, or self-awareness, awareness of the individual I. But Hegel has this very interesting way of thinking about self-consciousness, where he doesn't think that, he thinks that necessarily involved in self-consciousness or self-awareness of myself as an individual I, this is essentially connected with a certain awareness of my being an I of a particular kind, of being a member of a particular Gattung. This is very clear in a variety of places in his texts. And so here I just want to flag that the idea of a Gattung has philosophical significance, and to show that it is not just these questions about taxonomy or classification when Hegel is interested in talking about Gattungen. So moving forward, what I'm going to say, given this philosophical significance of the concept of the Gattung, moving forward, basically what I'm going to suggest is that what admits of an identifiable Gattungsprozess, that when can we speak of a Gattungsprozess? We can speak of a Gattungsprozess when members of a Gattung can participate in processes that are capable of generating individuality, a process that can produce and reproduce individuality. And this is this passage here I'm taking from Hegel's Science of Logic, that essentially what the processes of the Gattung do is that they allow us to generate individuality. So as I already mentioned, I'm using that, so this, in this sense, I'm going to use the term species rather than genus. So I'm going to say that Gattung refers to species and species life, processes through which individuals are generated, produced, and reproduced as individuals belonging to a species. Of course, the generation of individuality also produces and reproduces the species. This is why, and later on we'll see, right, individual and social reproduction are really processes that are bound together. Just looking ahead a little bit, so what I'm going to focus on are the conditions of generating and reproducing individuality. But more specifically, I'm interested in the conditions of generating and reproducing free individuality. And especially when we get to the section on ethical life, it's clear that what's at stake is not just individuality as such, but free individuality. It could even be that these perhaps, I don't think it's actually redundant, but in the sphere of ethical life, I think the idea of individuality certainly implies freedom. And so this is going to be something that where the Gattungsprozess becomes important even in ethical life, because it somehow helps us understand the conditions of reproducing free individuality. So I'm going to do this part quickly, and I'm not going to talk, there's, I think, 5 key discussions basically of the species or the Gattung and its process in Hegel's work. Maybe just one interesting thing to note is how widely it cuts across the different aspects of his philosophical system, and from the phenomenology to the science of logic, to his encyclopedia logic, to his philosophy of nature, and to the philosophy of right, where questions of freedom and ethical life, I think, are most significant. So I'm not gonna, I think it's important that we see how widespread discussion of this idea is, so that it's not just sort of an idiosyncratic part of some localized discussion, but it really is an idea that stretches across the system. I'm not going to, for the purposes of time, I won't go through each of these in the same amount of detail. This first discussion of the species or the simple Gattung is connected with Hegel's understanding of the processes of life, but also of this idea of a living self-consciousness. I already mentioned earlier that one of the most philosophically significant what Hegel takes, one of the things that Hegel takes to be the most philosophically significant about the idea of a Gattung is its connection to self-consciousness, that we can't understand self-consciousness without understanding its connection with our awareness of being a member of a species and being in a reflexive relation to a species. So this is, I think, a very rich and complicated and important idea in Hegel, but self-consciousness is not the focus of my talk today. But this is one key discussion of the idea of the Gattung and its process that I think is very important. The second, which I will say a little bit more about, because I think it is here that I'm going to pick out what I call the three sort of normative constraints that we can identify in understanding the Gattungsprozess. The second discussion is in the science of logic. Near the end of the science of logic, in the last section, there is a very now much more widely discussed chapter on life, where Hegel focuses on he paints a picture of, you know, the living individual as participating in life processes and in participating in processes of the genus. This chapter is very complicated, and of course the fact that it is a logical concept of life, right? There's a whole other talk that I could give, and we could have a discussion about that. I'm going to sort of bracket the question of logic here today, and instead just focus on thinking about what Hegel says about the process of the genus that can be helpful for understanding features of ethical life that I'm going to talk about later. I think one really exciting thing about how Hegel understands life is how much he anticipated in terms of how we think about our living individual today as embodied, as essentially connected with an environment, as participating in the life of in the broader life of a species. That he took all of our powers of cognition and agency as necessarily connected with our activity as living beings. I find all of this to be incredibly exciting, and lots of, right, one could draw lots of connections with contemporary discussions. But for now, what I want to focus on, so what does Hegel say exactly about the process of the genus here? He says, as the third moment of this you know, so we've got the living individual in the life process, and then the process of the genus. As the third moment, Hegel says that the Gattung, or the species, is a kind of universal moment in which the idea of life reaches its completion. And what's unique, again, at the most abstract level, what's unique about the Gattungsprozess, in contrast to, say, processes of the living individual in connection with its environment, is that in the Gattungsprozess, what we are interested in is a living individual facing an object, quote, with which it is identical. And it faces, he says, a form which is therefore immediately reciprocal. So already in his very abstract discussion in the logic of this idea of a species process, he's clearly anticipating, right, some of these ideas of reciprocal recognition that he develops elsewhere. It's very clear that again, a living individual is in process with all kinds of, constantly with its environment, as an embodied being. But the key difference between, right, what distinguishes just any interaction with something outside me in my environment, and what we can call an interaction or process that is a part of the Gattungsprozess, concerns the fact that we are thinking about a living individual facing an object with which it is identical, with which it has a reciprocal form. I already mentioned this emphasis on the idea of the generation of individuality. Again, these are just some passages where Hegel is very clear that in the Gattungsprozess, the processes result in the duplication of the individual, or the generation of individuality. But what I think is most important from the science of logic account of the Gattungsprozess is that it outlines three structural features of the Gattungsprozess in general, and that I think we can think about these three structural features as setting, right, certain normative constraints on how we might understand and evaluate the way in which species life comes to be realized in ethical life. Another thing that I'm going to try to say later is that it's very important for the institutions of ethical life that we meet these three conditions, and that insofar as institutions of ethical life are failing in some respect in meeting, right, these three conditions of the Gattungsprozess, we have reasons for criticism, or for thinking about how we might change, right, the institutions of ethical life so that they can better provide these conditions for individuality. So the first concerns the importance of needs. It is very clear for Hegel that the entire process, the process of life, the process of the species, that it really begins and is driven by this the importance of needs and how living individuals come to meet their needs, both as an individual and for the broader, right, for the species as a whole. So the emphasis on needs is something that I think is very important in his account of the Gattungsprozess, and we see it show up in very important and interesting ways, as we'll see in the next section, in ethical life. In fact, I think all three of these show up in very important ways in ethical life. The second is one that I already mentioned in terms of that the species process is understood as a relationship between a living individual and another living individual of an identical form. And Hegel uses there's a term that he uses in particular within this context that he doesn't use, again, when he's thinking just about a living individual in relation to some object. He uses the term verlangen, which has implications, I think, of longing, demand, and that there's between the relation between conspecifics entails a reciprocal demand for the other of an identical form. And I think his use of this term, this is a very particular term that shows up here. It doesn't really show up when he's talking about, again, a living thing in relation to any other kind of object. I think it anticipates the importance of the demand for recognition that we see in the ethical and spiritual domain. But I want to say that this is, I think, built into the very idea of being a member of a species. Earlier I said that, living beings and social beings, these things are, and we see here that Hegel clearly thinks that living beings are sort of by definition, or as a structural feature of a living thing, is that it is a social being in this very deep way. The third concerns this problem of death. Whenever Hegel talks about the Gattung or the genus, death is always a very central part of the story. So what he says in that the genus process, or sorry, the Gattungsprozess, the process of the species, is that it sort of is this infinite process where he says singular individuals die away. In the process of the Gattung, the isolated singularities of individual life perish. And through the dying away of individuals, he says that the species is realized and the Gattung becomes for itself, or becomes spirit. Again, there's a lot more to say here, but one thing I do think that is important about this emphasis on death is, again, to consider how in ethical life we continue to try to grapple with, right? So presumably spirit is not an infinite process where individuals are simply reproducing and then dying away, right? And a kind of bad infinite. But nonetheless, spirit does have to find ways, the institutions of ethical life have to find ways of dealing with problems of death, but not only death, but also illness and disease. And so this is something that I think attention to the Gattungsprozess allows us to track once we get into the sphere of ethical life. Okay, so that's the second moment, and I promise the next two, we're going to go a lot, the next three rather, we're going to go a lot faster. It's really just to show you how how wide-ranging this idea of the Gattung is in Hegel. In the encyclopedia, he talks about this idea of a free Gattung for itself when he's thinking about the transition from life to cognition, or life to spiritual forms of mindedness. It's also in the philosophy of nature. Perhaps it's most unsurprising that the idea of the Gattungsprozess shows up in the philosophy of nature in his discussion of animal organisms. I won't read this whole passage, but here, basically what this passage affirms is that the Gattungsprozess is a process that begins with needs, that there is a special relationship of longing and a special relationship between conspecifics, where he says we feel the other as its own self. He also here, a very important term, sorry, self-feeling, there's a typo there. that our relationship in processes of the species are ones of self-feeling or Selbstgefühl, which again, if we continue to track how Hegel uses these terms, we'll see again when he talks about our relationship to ethical life. And so the philosophy of nature account basically reiterates, and I think just it really enriches what we already know and what Hegel has already said elsewhere about the process of the genus. There's also a very interesting discussion of disease and death in this section on the animal organism. And Hegel also talks about forms of therapy, again, already at the level of the animal organism, where death and disease are things that have to be addressed, but also we try to ameliorate. So the philosophy of nature discussion is very interesting, but I won't say anything more about it here. Fifth, and finally, which this is an interesting one because it will provide us with a nice transition as we move to the discussion of ethical life. In the philosophy of right, in Hegel's discussion of the family, he brings up this idea of the species and its process in the discussion of family and marriage, and the ethical relationship of marriage, of the family as such. Again, we don't necessarily, we don't need to, I'll talk about the family in the next section. We don't need to accept a lot of the things that Hegel says about family and marriage, and that can be something we talk about in the discussion. But even if we don't accept everything that Hegel says about marriage and the family in the philosophy of right, I think it's important that he continues to think about this idea of the Gattungsprozess in his understanding of the family and how individuals, and especially free individuals, are produced and reproduced in ethical life. And also that the idea, this more very vague idea of Verlangen gets developed not only into forms of recognition, but of course into here what he calls self-conscious love within the family, whether in marriage or between parents and children. And so this is just another passage in paragraph 173 from the philosophy of right, where he suggests that the progression of generations produce and presuppose one another, and that this is important when we try to understand institutions of ethical life, and especially in the family. So the upshot. I've sort of gone through this idea of the process of the species. Basically, what's the upshot? Why is this discussion important? The Gattungsprozess for Hegel provides us with the necessary conditions for the production and reproduction of individuals, and most importantly, including the production and reproduction of free individuals. The Gattungsprozess mediates and provides conditions for three requirements of producing and reproducing individuality, and most specifically, these three conditions that have to be met, and I think provide some normative standards or constraints when we try to understand and evaluate ethical life, that the Gattungsprozess mediates the meeting of needs, the reciprocal urge and longing or demand for the other of reciprocal or identical form, and then third, addressing and ameliorating disease and death. The last upshot I want to mention here, one thing I think is important for thinking about the Gattungsprozess, and especially now that I'm going to move on to the next section to talk about ethical life. I think the idea of a Gattungsprozess cuts across a nature-Geist divide, or a nature-spirit, nature-mind, right, nature-human divide. It's not that the Gattungsprozess is merely a natural, this is how I don't want to think about it. Processes of the species are not merely natural processes, and then of course we have these ethical and spiritual processes that are, right, that we really shouldn't understand in terms of a Gattungsprozess. Instead, I want to see the Gattungsprozess as cutting across this divide, as, right, being a process that allows us to understand both individual and social reproduction, that sets certain constraints for how, as living and social beings, as a living species among other living species, that this idea of a Gattungsprozess sets certain constraints for the successful individual and social reproduction. And one of the claims I'm making is that I want to interpret this as cutting across the nature-Geist divide rather than putting species processes on the side of nature and then Geist is something else. Okay, so then I'm going to now move on to this next section where I want to talk about ethical life as a self-conscious Gattungsprozess, and I'm going to focus specifically on family and civil society. As I mentioned, so what does it mean to think about species life in ethical, not just in ethical life, but also species life as ethical life, that ethical life is a mode of species life, a mode of, a way of being, a way of living, and reproducing ourselves as a species. As I mentioned, and I just want to highlight this again, since we're now very specifically talking about ethical life, that these processes are important because they produce and reproduce individuals, not just individuals, but reproduce and produce free individuals. Now we can, when we talk about the production of free individuals, it's very clear that we're also talking about social reproduction. And by this, I mean, again, very broadly here. In the next section, I'll talk a little more specifically about social reproduction theory, but here, by social reproduction, I just mean the reproduction of society, the reproduction of a form of life. How do we reproduce ourselves as a society and reproduce ourselves as a form of life? And in so doing, and at the same time, also produce and reproduce free individuals. In the sphere of ethical life, what is clearly most important for Hegel is reproducing the institutional conditions for the production and reproduction of free individuals. I want to flag that this language of production and reproduction, this language of life. So the English ethical life is the English translation of Hegel's term Sittlichkeit. Of course, life is not actually in the German term Sittlichkeit, but as many scholars, English and German scholars have noted, I think a lot of people in the Hegel communities have noted, ethical life is actually despite the word life not being in Sittlichkeit, is actually a very excellent translation of the term in capturing the spirit of what Hegel is trying to understand. And I just wanted to note that we should take this idea of ethical life and this idea of production and reproduction, we can take it quite literally, because it's very clear for Hegel that forms of life, not just individuals, die and could be subject to disease and death and pathology, but forms of life also can die and fall ill and so on and so forth. So this issue of death that we saw as being very important for the Gattungsprozess is clearly built into how Hegel understands ethical life and its historical shapes. One thing I want to note here before moving forward is that I want to be very clear, and this is maybe just heading off an objection, I want to be very clear that talking of species life and its processes not only cuts across the nature-Geist divide, I think the importance of and reference to processes of the species and this idea of the production and reproduction of free individuals in no way implies that there is an imperative for specific individuals to procreate. So I want to really block that objection or worry. What I am primarily interested in, and I think what Hegel is interested in, are the conditions of the social reproduction of free individuals. And we can put it in the form of a hypothetical. For those of you who are interested, who know and are interested in Fichte, I sort of formulated this in a hypothetical in the same way that Fichte does in his Foundations of Natural Right. The question is, if we want to produce free individuals, what are the social conditions of their production? So I don't in any way want this emphasis on species life to imply, right, some imperative for procreation. I don't think it's built into that at all. It's really this question of, if we want to produce and reproduce free individuals, what are the social conditions necessary for this reproduction? And of course, it should go out without saying that there are clearly a myriad of ways for individuals to contribute to the production and reproduction of free individuality that do not involve literal procreation. And perhaps more importantly, and as important, maybe less obvious, literal procreation in no way guarantees the conditions for free individuality. So I just want to block that worry about any, imperative or necessity for procreation, because I think that's a non-starter. Okay, so with respect to ethical life, very broadly, what Hegel calls ethical substance, and he refers to this sometimes in terms of laws, sometimes in terms of powers, often in terms of processes. What Hegel calls ethical substance essentially provide the conditions for the production and reproduction of free individuals. In the literature on the philosophy of right, we often talk about this idea of production of free individual. I'm sort of importing, it's a more Fichtean and maybe Marxian formulation. The Hegelian formulation is the actualization of freedom, but I want to basically suggest that they're essentially connected. And ethical substance essentially consists, right, when Hegel says its laws, its powers, its institutions, its practices, right? These are the things that sustain and produce and reproduce free individuality. Now, something very interesting, how do individuals relate to the ethical conditions of their reproduction? One thing that we might say about the non-spiritual or non-ethical Gattungsprozess that we were talking about earlier is that it seems that a lot of this takes place unconsciously. That, right, we participate in these processes in a kind of unconscious way. Clearly, when Hegel is talking about Geist and the domain of ethical life, he wants to be clear that individuals relate to the ethical conditions of their reproduction in the manner of self-consciousness, so that we are aware of them, we can see how they shape us, we can try to reshape these conditions. But one interesting thing, and I'm just pulling something that we see in paragraph 147 of the Philosophy of Right, that Hegel nonetheless, right, so of course we relate to the ethical conditions of our reproduction in a self-conscious manner, but also we also relate to them irreducibly in the manner of Selbstgefühl. So this self-feeling that we see in the process of the species, and how we, this more, right, not fully below, something below the level of full consciousness, that self-feeling is a fundamental and irreducible way in which individuals relate to ethical life, the ethical conditions for their reproduction. And he says that it's in referring to this in terms of Selbstgefühl, he also says it's a relationship closer than faith or trust. And I just wanted to mention this, that it's clear that, you know, I said that ethical life is a self-conscious Gattungsprozess, but I don't want to downplay the importance of feeling and self-feeling as irreducible modes of the Gattungsprozess that are still present in ethical life. If we want to understand the idea of an ethical Gattungsprozess or an ethical species process, we can understand ethical life providing the conditions for the production of free individuals, and that an ethical Gattungsprozess has to meet the three requirements that I mentioned above in an ethically mediated way, so that we understand these three requirements, right? The meeting of needs, meeting demands for, in the ethical sphere, primarily we talk about this in terms of recognition, and then addressing issues of death and disease and somehow ameliorating them, that these are primary functions of ethical life. And we're going to see in a minute, when I turn to the specific institutions of family and civil society, how these features of the Gattungsprozess give shape to these institutions. So before I turn to the family and civil society, I just wanted to maybe say one thing right, ethical life is three institutions. Why am I only talking about family and civil society? In some ways here, I am taking a cue from Marx and Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, in which he sort of, right, very in the famous, somewhat misleading, but nonetheless, right, often mentioned that, you know, Marx turns Hegel on its head. One of the criticisms that Marx offers in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right is that Hegel gives so much, right, he puts so much emphasis on the state as the foundation, as the absolute foundation of ethical life, as that which allows us to understand all of the other aspects of it. And Marx thinks that there's something about this that's slightly inverted. So I'll read the short passage. He says that, but this is to say that the political state cannot exist without the natural basis of the family and the artificial basis of civil society. They are its conditio sine qua non, but the conditions are established as the condition, the determining as the determined, the producing as the product of its product. essentially what he's saying is that Hegel inverts the order of conditioning, that really to understand ethical life, we need to understand family and civil society as the basis and the political state. So it's not that it's just but the political state makes sense in connection with the processes that go on in family and civil society, and that we shouldn't understand things the other way around, where the political state determines what happens in family and civil society. So this is one reason why I'm focusing on family and civil society. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. It's not, I think bringing in the state is actually important and interesting here, but also for the purposes of time, I'm only going to talk about family and civil society, and one justification for this is just taking a cue from Marx, insofar as I'm interested in thinking about ethical life as an outgrowth of these Gattungsprozesse. Another sort of important, this is just another sort of, I guess, Marxian justification for why family and civil society, and this emphasis on the production and reproduction of free individuals. For Marx, in the German ideology, when he provides, in the broadest possible sense, the outlines of what he calls historical materialism, he says that what we begin with, of course, right, he says, are real living human individuals. And what do these real living human individuals do? They satisfy their needs, they produce they produce material life. Of course, this is already a historical act. They make other individuals. They produce and reproduce other free individuals. And it's very clear that Marx treats this as both a natural and social relationship. This is another way of articulating my claim that I want to interpret Hegel's account of the Gattungsprozess as cutting across these natural and social, or natural and ethical, or natural and spiritual divides. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the family. So essentially what I want to draw out here is that the family, we can see the Gattungsprozess at work in every aspect of how Hegel understands the family. And of course, I'm just going to focus on these three features that I've identified as, right, these three conditions, these structural requirements of a Gattungsprozess. It's very clear that for Hegel, one of the primary functions, if not the primary, one of the primary functions of the family is to meet the family's needs. And Hegel's discussion of this in the Philosophy of Right is an extensive discussion of the family's resources, the family's property, assets, or wealth, broadly construed, and how this is acquired and managed in order to fulfill this absolutely important function, this crucial requirement of the Gattungsprozess of meeting the family's needs. Now, Hegel's way of understanding this is patriarchal, and I don't think we need to, and I do not, we don't need to, and I do not affirm his patriarchal understanding of this, but I think it's still important to note that in his patriarchal understanding of the family, he understands that this primarily in terms of meeting the family's needs. So he says, right, the family is a legal person in relation to others, must be represented by the husband as its head. But what is the head of the house primarily responsible for? Primarily responsible for external acquisition and for caring for the family's needs, as well as for the control and administration of the family's resources. So meeting the family's needs is the key, right? This is one of the primary responsibilities of being the head of house. And of course, we could disagree with Hegel that this needs to be patriarchal, but regardless, right, clearly that one of the main functions here concerns meeting the family's needs. A second way in which Hegel understands the processes and the function of the family concerns this issue of dependency, love, and recognition. And in fact, the family is a very distinctive sphere in which certain forms of care, love, dependency, and recognition have their primary home. Again, Hegel thinks about marriage, and again, we don't have to agree with everything Hegel says about marriage, But what he is identifying is that there's a specific kind of bond and ethical love that takes place within the family, that certain needs for recognition are met within the family, whether in marriage or in the upbringing of children. The issue of love is sprinkled all in Hegel's entire account of both marriage and the upbringing of children. This emphasis on love, there's something quite romantic about it, in some respects, is a key feature of the family. It's clearly not, right, this is clearly a historically specific way of thinking about the family, but I think it tracks what is so, right, it tracks the need for the family to meet these requirements of the Gattungsprozess. The third concerns death. He thinks about the natural dissolution of the family through the death of the parents. And one of the ways, so in the philosophy of right, the issue of death is very importantly connected with these questions of inheritance, which are connected with the question of meeting needs. But if we look at other places in Hegel, we can think about Hegel's account of the ancient family and Antigone, and that one of the roles of the family in ancient ethical life, for example, is to care for the dead. And so I think that these three, right, meeting needs, meeting certain demands for recognition, caring for, acknowledging, addressing questions of death, and care for the dead are really clearly important features of the family that are that show us the way in which the family is a kind of ethical mediation of the Gattungsprozess. Okay, so civil society is next, and here again, I just want to flag how absolutely essential these three these three requirements really give shape to all of the functions of civil society. In a way, needs is the most obvious because Hegel refers to, right, this idea of a system of needs. He says that everything about civil society is occasioned by need. And when he speaks about needs, one interesting feature of this is that he refers to the idea of a human being. He doesn't talk about the human being very much in the philosophy of right. Mostly he talks about persons. He talks about self-consciousness. He's clearly interested in thinking about ethical agents, but only when he's talking about needs, he speaks specifically about the human being. And it's very clear that the entire, right, he says the mediation of need and the satisfaction of the individual through his work, the satisfaction of needs of all the others, this is what he calls a system of needs. With respect to the second requirement of recognition, the one thing that civil society is supposed to provide is not only, right, a way for us to meet our needs, but we do this through work. And our participation in what Hegel calls the estates, this is a very complicated and somewhat even for his time, somewhat outdated notion. But we can think broadly that work belongs to, right, not just work is work of, we belong to professions, we belong to certain social groups. Maybe we can call this classes, but this is controversial and another topic. But the key here, our work in civil society is not only, right, supposed to help us meet our needs. He says it's supposed to help us gain recognition in his own eyes and in the eyes of others. I'm just going to speed up a little bit here. So the last thing, one third interesting moment of civil society, when we want to think about questions of disease and death, is that in civil, you might think that these are things that the state does, but Hegel discusses all of this under the heading of civil society, that a public authority is supposed to provide public provisions that include things like education, importantly, public health. He has some discussions of public health that I think are very interesting, and that even the discussion, the famous discussion in the philosophy of right of poverty and the rabble, that what is concerning to Hegel is that poverty and the kind of life that the rabble are reduced to amounts to a kind of social death. And so I just want to say that these questions of obvious needs and recognition, I think, are very obviously highlighted in civil society, but the questions of disease and death, the importance of education and public health, that the problem of poverty is not only a sort of problem of a material problem, although it is that, but also a question of social death, I think is a very important aspect of how Hegel understands the functions and processes of civil society. Okay, so the upshot here before I head to my very brief conclusion. The requirements of the Gattungsprozess, so what I want to say is that the requirements of the Gattungsprozess are basically met, they're ethically mediated in processes of ethical life, and in particular in the family and civil society. These institutions provide the material and ethical conditions for the production of free individuals by meeting needs, by answering demands for recognition, and for addressing and ameliorating disease and death. And I think this is how I want to begin to think about this idea of a Gattungsprozess, so the processes and requirements of species life in and as ethical life. So that it's not that there is, right, Gattungsprozesse on the one side and ethical life on the other, but that these processes and requirements of species life really are not only in and a part of ethical life, but really they exist as ethical life. Okay, so my third and final, very quick, brief, so basically, how does understanding this relationship between species life and ethical life in Hegel, how might it speak to some contemporary questions and concerns? Since I've been so interested, since I think what Hegel's account provides us with is this theory of individual and social reproduction. In contemporary debates that sort of come out of a Marxian tradition, what is now called social reproduction theory, there is a separation. So how do they understand questions of social reproduction? These theorists argue that that the separation between waged and unwaged work, and not only waged and unwaged, but there's also waged and underwaged work that contributes to the processes of the species. This separation creates dysfunction, pathology, crisis in a capitalist system in which the production of individual wage laborers depends and free rides upon what is called social reproductive labor that is unwaged, underwaged, and in some cases even expropriated. Basically, the social reproductive work of the Gattungsprozess. A very prominent, I'm just going to take, there are many accounts of this, but I think Nancy Fraser provides us with a particularly clear account of what this social reproductive labor is. It is work that, she says, tends to families, maintains households, sustains communities, nourishes friendships, builds political networks, forges solidarities. Often referred to as care work, these activities are indispensable to society. They replenish human beings, both daily and generationally, across generations. They maintain social bonds. Without this work of social reproduction, as I shall call it, there could be no production or profit or capital, no economy or culture or state. That's important. It's clear that Fraser is in some ways echoing Marx's critique of Hegel, that we need to see the state not as the foundation, but think about this social reproductive work as sustaining these other domains. Very broadly, this means that social reproductive labor is care work, consistent education, connected with healthcare, community building, public works and services. And essentially, I think what we can say is that the social reproductive labor is the work of the Gattungsprozess. So last thing I want to say here, and I realize this is very, very quick, but I do think that Hegel might help us think about these questions of individual and social reproduction in connection with contemporary debates. So just very briefly, what can Hegel contribute here? I think it's very clear that Hegel's not interested, of course, in the production of wage laborers or the need for the creation of more capital. Again, the emphasis that Hegel provides is he's interested in the conditions for the production of free individuals. And keeping that question in view, I think can allow us to rethink or recalibrate some of these questions of social reproduction. I think Hegel's account of the Gattungsprozess can also allow us to grant priority to producing according to necessary material and social conditions of producing free individuals. And so that's We produce, obviously not in accordance with the need for the creation of more capital, but we produce in accordance with these, right, necessary material social conditions for free individuality. I think Hegel also gives us a different view as to how the work of the Gattungsprozess can be distributed across society. So I think Hegel's account really cuts across distinctions that maybe have become entrenched in some of these debates, including the distinction between the waged and the unwaged, the public and the private. I think it's clear that the work of the Gattungsprozess for Hegel is not just a private matter, but cuts across the public and private. It's clear that public services are part of this. And I also think for Hegel, it's clear that production and reproduction are not clearly separated. Finally, I do think that as far as in terms of a philosophical and normative account, I think what Hegel contributes in his account of the Gattungsprozess is that it allows us to think about and set some minimum normative requirements for the successful reproduction of a rational form of ethical life, that we can think about these requirements and whether or not they're being met or not met, how we might reshape forms, institutions, and practices and forms of ethical life in accordance with these requirements. I think this is one of the key contributions of thinking about the Gattungsprozess with Hegel, and also of thinking about this essential connection between species life and ethical life. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening and for sticking with me